You're reading an article about a war in a country you couldn't have placed on a map 5 years ago. The article gives decent arguments for why the aggressor of the war is the bad guy, but then you open another article and they are giving decent counterpoints about why the war effort by the aggressor is a just cause. You're trying to come up with a good opinion to hold on this war that you have no power over, yet there's so many conflicting narratives on it. All this contemplation on the struggles across the world happens while you're eating breakfast about to head to work. By lunch, you'll have absorbed more conflicting information about the state of the world than a medieval person encountered in a lifetime. By dinner, your brain will have processed claims from dozens of competing worldviews, each one arriving with the same authority, each one demanding you form an opinion. You won't have formed opinions on most of them. You'll just feel heavy, a low buzzing exhaustion or anxiety due to your inability to process all this stuff you're reading about. We tend to call this information overload, as if the problem is volume, as if your brain is a hard drive running out of storage. The real problem is that every piece of information arriving in your feed carries with it an entire worldview, an entire set of assumptions about what matters and what is real. A Chinese state news article and a Western editorial about the same event are speaking from entirely different realities, and we often consume both in just seconds of each other. A medieval French peasant and a Song dynasty farmer held beliefs about the world that would have been mutually incomprehensible, but neither of them ever had to hold both at the same time. The distance between their worlds was measured in oceans and centuries. Today, that distance has collapsed to the width of a thumb swipe, and the place where all these incompatible realities now collide is inside individual human minds that are evolved to operate within one coherent story about how things are. We are the first humans in history who have to do this, and we are only beginning to feel the cost. The temptation here is to romanticize the past as a time when everyone agreed, but of course they didn't. Medieval Europe was full of heretics, skeptics, and feuding theologians. The Byzantine and Islamic worlds spent centuries locked in military and intellectual conflict. The Aztecs and the Inca built civilizations on foundations that would have been unrecognizable to each other. Humans have always lived in radically different informational worlds. The difference is that each person only lived in one of them at a time. A peasant in 12th century France may have heard rumors about Saracens in the East who worshiped differently and organized their societies around unfamiliar principles. Those rumors arrived slowly, filtered through the priest's sermon or a traveler's story, already translated into the peasant's own framework. The Saracen was a character in the peasant's world, understood through the peasant's categories. The Saracen's actual worldview, the version that made sense from inside Islam, never reached that village. The walls of geography, language, and the speed of a horse kept it out. And those walls did something that we've only recently begun to appreciate. They kept each human mind inside a single coherent story. The sociologist Peter Berger called this a plausibility structure, the social environment that makes a worldview feel obviously self-evidently true. Your priest confirms it, your neighbor confirms it, the rhythm of the harvest confirms it. You breathe your worldview. It is the medium you move through, and every single input you receive in a given day reinforces it. This coherence was not necessarily peaceful. To live inside a totalizing story is to live with the high-voltage tension of absolute certainty. The same structure that gave the peasant a stable mind also gave him the conviction to burn a neighbor as a witch or die in a crusade. It was a stifling, often violent stability. The walls that kept the world out also kept the mind locked in, but it was stability nonetheless. This meant that when a foreign idea did arrive, it was absorbed into an existing structure that was strong enough to hold it. A Roman citizen in the 2nd century knew that Persians worshipped fire and that Germanic tribes had strange customs. But he had a place to stand. He evaluated the foreign from within a framework that felt as solid as the ground under his feet. The information was interesting, maybe threatening, maybe useful. It landed inside a mind that already knew what it believed. That solidity was a product of environment. When every person you know, every building you see, every story you hear, and every ritual you perform all point in the same direction, the mind settles into a kind of equilibrium. Reality feels stable. You can think clearly within it, argue within it, even doubt within it, because the container holds. The container is what we've lost. The collapse of this stable, consistent worldview happened in stages, and each stage put new weight on the individual mind. The printing press in the 15th and 16th centuries was the first major breach. Before print, a competing worldview had to travel by mouth or by hand-copied manuscript. Both were slow, expensive, and easy for authorities to contain. Print changed the economics entirely. Suddenly, a heretical idea could be reproduced cheaply, in the vernacular, and distributed across an entire region before anyone in power had time to respond. Martin Luther's 95 Theses spread across Germany in weeks. Within a generation, Europe was fractured along religious lines that would fuel wars for the next 2 centuries. Millions of minds were, for the first time, exposed to a live alternative to the story they'd been breathing since birth. The plausibility structure had cracked. The telegraph in the 19th century broke something else. For the entirety of human history up to that point, information traveled at the speed of a physical object. A horse, a ship, a runner. The telegraph completely bypassed that connection. An event in India could appear in a London newspaper the next morning. The historian James Carey argued that this created an entirely new category of experience, news from nowhere. Events that had no connection to your life, your community, or your ability to act arrived in your awareness simply because they had happened. The mind began to fill with things it could witness but never touch. Radio and television accelerated the process across the 20th century, but each of these still required a deliberate act of engagement. You turned on the radio, you sat in front of the television at a scheduled hour. You chose, at least in some minimal sense, to open yourself to new information. The smartphone basically removed that choice entirely. Beginning in the late 2000s, information stopped waiting for you to seek it out. It arrived continuously, in your pocket, across every waking hour. It interrupted meals, it woke you up, it followed you into every room of your house. And the content it delivered was no longer filtered through a single national broadcast or a local paper's editorial judgment. The algorithm assembled a feed from everywhere on Earth simultaneously, ordered by what would hold your attention the longest, with no regard for coherence. Clips about tragedies occurring across the world all arrive in the same stream, presented with the same visual authority, separated by nothing but a quick swipe of the thumb. The walls that had once separated these informational worlds had been torn down, with access to it all in our pocket, like the Palantir in Lord of the Rings. We look into the crystal and try to take in all this information that our brains are not designed to hold at once. The collapse of those walls gave us something genuinely worth having. The ability to encounter other ways of seeing, to challenge inherited certainties, to arrive at your own conclusions rather than simply absorbing the ones you were born into. That freedom is a good thing, but it came with a cognitive cost that we have barely begun to reckon with. Human social cognition evolved for a group of roughly 150 people. That number comes from the anthropologist Robin Dunbar, who found a consistent correlation between primate brain size and social group size. Our neocortex can maintain stable, meaningful relationships with about 150 people. Beyond that, the machinery starts to strain. This was the size of the world your mind was built to model. That mind now receives every single day input from thousands of sources representing hundreds of incompatible belief systems, each one carrying its own assumptions about what is true, what is moral, and what the future holds. The cognitive system does not scale to meet this, it buckles. The psychologist Leon Festinger documented what happens when a mind holds two incompatible beliefs at the same time. He called it cognitive dissonance, and he demonstrated that the experience is genuinely painful, that the mind will distort reality, reject evidence, and rationalize almost anything to make the dissonance stop. His research involved people encountering one or two contradictions in a controlled setting. We encountered dozens before breakfast. The dissonance has become chronic, a background hum that most people stop noticing. They've never known its absence. The mind adapts to this chronic strain in predictable ways. Some people collapse into tribal certainty. They pick one worldview and fortify it against all others. Every contradictory input becomes evidence of enemy action. This is cognitively efficient, but it's also brittle. The person inside that fortress can function, but they cannot learn, because learning requires entertaining the possibility that you are wrong, and the fortress was built specifically to prevent that feeling. Some people retreat into cynicism. If every worldview is contaminated by bias, if every source has an agenda, if every narrative is somebody's propaganda, then the safest position is to believe nothing. This feels sophisticated. It is actually a form of surrender. The cynic has not risen above the information war. They have been exhausted by it and dressed up their exhaustion as wisdom. Some people dissociate. They continue to absorb information at enormous volumes without processing any of it. The eyes move, the thumb scrolls, the content passes through awareness and leaves almost no trace. This is what most doomscrolling actually looks like from the inside. The mind has found a way to present the stream without being affected by it, a kind of cognitive anesthesia that protects the system from overload by quietly shutting down the part that cares. The psychiatrist R.D. Laing had a term for what underlies all these responses: ontological insecurity. The loss of a basic, pre-reflective confidence that reality is stable and that you can trust the ground you're standing on. The sociologist Anthony Giddens later argued that this condition, which Laing had observed in clinical patients, was becoming the default psychological state of ordinary people living in late modernity. He wrote that in the 1990s, the smartphone had not even yet been invented. Every one of these adaptations, the tribalism, the cynicism, the dissociation, is a strategy for managing a load the mind was never designed to carry, and every one of them comes at a cost. The tribalist loses the ability to think, the cynic loses the ability to trust, the dissociated person loses the ability to feel. These are injuries, not character flaws, sustained in an environment that delivers more contradictory reality per hour than any previous generation encountered in a year. So what can we actually do about this? Is the answer really just the typical phone bad? Well, consuming less would help. If you can reduce the volume of contradictory input reaching your mind on a given day, you should. But for most people, this advice functions about as well as telling someone to eat less without addressing why they're hungry. The algorithms are engineered to hold attention. The meaning vacuum that keeps people reaching for their phones is still there, and reducing intake through discipline alone, without anything to replace the habit, tends to last about as long as any other white-knuckle resolution. The phone is filling a hole. For the very few of us, willpower alone does work, but for the rest of us, willpower doesn't fill holes. The deeper problem is that we are each processing the entire world's output individually. This is the part that has no historical precedent. In every previous era, the work of making sense of reality was distributed across a community. The priests interpreted spiritual events, the elders interpreted social ones, the traditions interpreted seasonal ones. The individual mind was never asked to hold the full weight of the world alone, because the community was a load-bearing structure. It carried most of the interpretive burden before any of it reached you. We have almost completely dismantled that structure, and we have replaced it with the individual sitting with a screen, expected to independently evaluate claims about epidemiology, economics, geopolitics, psychology, nutrition, climate science, and the moral character of strangers on the other side of the planet. Every single day, with no training, no elders, and no shared framework to fall back on. But if the weight comes from processing alone, the relief comes from processing together. The same piece of news discussed in person with 3 people you trust becomes a fundamentally different cognitive event than that same piece of news absorbed in isolation at 1 a.m. In conversation, the load is shared. Someone catches what you missed. Someone challenges your first reaction. Someone puts it in a context you hadn't considered. The information moves through a small community before it settles in your mind, and by the time it settles, it has been shaped into something your cognition can actually hold. This is what the plausibility structure used to do automatically. In its absence, we have to build it manually. This also means accepting something that the modern world resists. You cannot and should not try to process everything or try to reconcile everything in your mind. You don't need to have the best take on everything that happens in the world. Sometimes we just don't know what to think about something, and that's perfectly fine. The medieval villager who knew nothing about Song Dynasty China was not failing. He was functioning within the limits of what a human mind can hold and still remain coherent. He was living in his world, concerned with the issues that affected him and his community directly, and those in Song Dynasty China were doing the same. There's a version of that boundary that we need to rebuild voluntarily, not out of ignorance, but out of recognition that a mind without borders is a mind without stability. Choosing to only go deep on a few things with people you trust in a place you belong to while ignoring the rest is how we can stay sane. It's not intellectual cowardice. Some would say it shows a lack of empathy to not keep up to date with every tragedy, or shows ignorance or stupidity to not have a political stance on every issue. But I think we need to be wise about the battles we choose to fight and the issues we choose to let consume our minds. Because if we try to make sense of it all, we inevitably fail and we hurt our well-being in the process. Thank you so much for watching. This was Folks of Yore. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting the like button, subscribing, and leave a comment about your thoughts. There are always so many thoughtful comments that I love reading through, so please keep them coming. Thanks again, and see you next time.